What are earthquakes? Why do they occur? What is happening? What causes them? Are they increasing? Should I be worried? Can we stop them? Are they manufactured? Well, tonight, we're going to break all of these questions down and hopefully answer some of them for you. You're looking at a map of the Earth, simplistic as it is, but it shows many of the plate boundaries that geologists like myself use to determine seismicity, volcanism, and many other geologic phenomena on the planet. Now, most of the earthquakes occurring on the planet are occurring on these plate boundaries, typically convergent plate boundaries, the dark black ones, but sometimes transform boundaries and oftentimes on divergent boundaries like mid-ocean ridges, where we see earthquakes all the time. Now, an earthquake in general is simply the earth cracking along typically a fault line due to stresses, and these can be many-fold. The explanations for the stresses could be plate movement. It could be isostatic rebound from weight like snow and ice. Earthquakes even occur from desertification, the drying of the planet, cracking of the earth. Earthquakes can occur from explosions and other man-made phenomena. But tonight we're going to break down earthquakes in general, how often they occur, and are they increasing? Now, how often do earthquakes occur? Well, Earth is an active place, and earthquakes are always happening somewhere. In fact, the National Earthquake Information Center locates about 12 to 14,000 earthquakes each year. And these are the larger magnitude, above 2 magnitude. Now we're going to show you a fact sheet that illustrates information on the frequency of earthquakes in just a second. But some of the key points are that earthquakes are always happening somewhere. And for each step up in magnitude, the annual number of earthquakes decreases by a factor of 10. And for each step up in magnitude, an earthquake releases 30 times more energy. And while the number of earthquakes that can be detected and located each year has been increasing, it doesn't mean the annual average number of earthquakes has increased. But it does mean we're detecting more of them. And that's because there's more detectors. But let's talk about what's really happening. Here you're looking at probably the most accepted scientific chart on magnitude versus frequency for earthquakes. And the number of earthquakes per year worldwide is at the bottom. So at 2 magnitude, there's about 1 million earthquakes annually worldwide. At 3 magnitude, there's 100,000 earthquakes annually worldwide. At 4 magnitude, there's 12,000 earthquakes worldwide annually. At 5 magnitude, just 2,000 quakes. At 6 magnitude, just 200 quakes. At 7 magnitude, just 20 quakes. And at 8 magnitude and higher, just 3 quakes annually is the average. Now, does this mean that every year we meet these averages? No, not even close. And what you're looking at is the number of earthquakes worldwide for the last decade, which, by the way, is an entire solar cycle. Now, the reason we're saying that is because we believe, and many others, that the sun controls earthquakes on Earth. And this chart alone is proof enough to prove that point. Solar minimum in 2011 saw the most earthquakes ever recorded for a decade in 5 to 5.9 magnitude, as well as 6 to 6.9, 7 to 7.9. You picking it up? And then a decade later, at the same time in the solar cycle, at solar minimum, the same thing occurred. The most earthquakes in a decade happened at the solar minimum. Now, as early as a decade ago, people were writing papers on the fact and questioning the fact that does the sun trigger earthquakes? Here's a 2012 release in June. And the work that they used was basically standard science, where you take data points, you put them on a graph, and you see if there's a connection. There was little, if any, correlation between sunspot number and earthquakes. I mean, there was a slight connection in 2012. You can see some kind of relationship, but it wasn't glaring and obvious. So most people concluded at this time that there is no connection between the sun, space weather, even. I don't have any of those papers up, but there's many questions if solar outbursts and CMEs could cause earthquakes, but they just said no. So the general consensus of the scientific community was no, the sun has nothing to do with earthquakes. And take a look at this graph. And that's the graph they used to disprove that the sun has anything to do with earthquakes. But let's talk about the correlation between solar activity and large earthquakes worldwide. I'll have to move this for y'all. There. You really can't get it. Let me get that over there. And this paper is pretty recent. It's a 2020 paper. And what they use here is machine learning to prove almost nothing. Because they're not really doing pure science. But many people in our field are doing pure science. And what we're talking about is the use of raw data and direct correlation to figure out causation. And in this field, there has been very high resolution showing that the solar polar fields, this is the magnetic field of our sun, is in control of large earthquakes, magnitude 7.5 or greater worldwide, specifically 8 mag or greater. And all of these large earthquakes occur on solar polar reversals or peaks, almost 90% of them. So there's a direct correlation between the solar polar field strength and large earthquakes on Earth. But did you know that the solar polar field strength is directly related to the solar cycle? In fact, that's what it is. And so it's hard to discount the facts. And we're going to be showing them to you now. The facts are that you're looking at the last solar cycle from 2011 to 2021. And that's solar cycle 24, which didn't begin in 2011. In fact, it probably began somewhere around 2009. And solar cycle 25 began sometime in 2019. But the peak in earthquakes happens 2 years after the minimum. In this case, for cycle 25, it happened in 2011. And for solar cycle 24, in solar cycle 24, it happened in 2011. And solar cycle 25, it happened in 2021. According to the data. So it's the second year after the minimum where the maximum earthquakes occur in almost all ranges. 4 to 4.9 maximum back in the last minimum 2 years after the minimum. 5 to 5.9 maximum happening 2 years after the minimum. 6 to 6.9 maximum after 2 years after the minimum. So there's something happening after the solar polar reversal, which creates the large earthquakes that then create all the other earthquakes. Completely mind-blowing. Now, we're about to get another solar polar reversal coming soon in a few years, so we should be expecting another very large earthquake, 8.5 or greater. But the one thing we should glean from the data is that we are at a deficit for large earthquakes. Because using all the data sets and the original graphic that we showed you here, This is based on all the historical earthquake data, and they're showing that there is an average of 3 earthquakes greater than 8 magnitude annually. But the recent data isn't showing that. In fact, it's showing much less than that. So it just luckily we hit the mark this year or last year, 2021, with 3 above 8 magnitude to 9.9. But in the previous decade, there was a deficit. Now, what does that mean for our future? In my opinion, I think that these stresses are internally kept in the earth and they will be released like the Kraken at some time in the future. And it's beginning now. But the uptick in earthquakes worldwide this year is pretty similar to the same time last solar cycle, albeit slightly less in the 5.59 magnitude, slightly more in the 4.49 magnitude, slightly less in the 6.69, but bigger in the 8.8 to 9.9. So the overall released energy is very similar. And if I would write this up in a paper, well, I would be attacked, at the same time get accolades. But I don't have the bandwidth or the wherewithal to make that happen. Because mainstream science is so polluted and disgusting that it serves no purpose, which is why I make this video. This video is the purpose. Anyone willing to listen with the eye for the science, it will be so clear to them, clear as day, because all of the information and the data sets will be linked below. So, is there an increase in earthquakes? Well, yes, because we're at the time when the most earthquakes occurred, and they just occurred. So next year shouldn't be so bad. It should be similar to this strip. And the year after that to this strip. The kicker is that it's the big earthquakes that matter, not all the 20,000 other quakes annually. Well, 15,000. But I do digress. It is the solar polar reversals that cause the big ones. And maybe as we're getting into some of the weakest solar cycles ever, the next big one is the 9.4 magnitude, which will ring the earth like Hunga Tonga. That's a boon to knowledge. Hope you got something out of the video. There's not an uptick in earthquakes whatsoever. There is an 11-year cycle forced by the sun, however, which is quite clear, and I think we showed our point quite spectacularly tonight. Should you be worried? No. Should you be prepared? Yes. Because the next big one is coming. And we told you so. And that's a boom to knowledge. Share this video with like-minded people. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Become a Patreon. Become a hero. We love you. That's a boom.